today our first guest, our first keynote is Agnieszka Sorokowska, who has kindly agreed to deliver the talk. Agnieszka is an associate professor at the Institute of Psychology, University of Wrocław. She is the head of Smell and Taste Research Lab, and she conducts research on sensory perception, cognitive, evolutionary, and cross-cultural psychology. Thank you again, Agnieszka, for agreeing to deliver this talk. The mic and the screen are yours.
Hello. Hi, Kasia. Hello, everyone. It's really nice to meet you and see you. And I hope you can see my presentation now. I'm also very sorry that I couldn't meet you in person today, but I'm very happy to see you online anyway. So the topic of my today's presentation are olfactory preferences, olfactory awareness, and odor sensitivity in an inter-individual and cross-cultural perspective. So before I get to the actual topic of my presentation, let me first explain how important is perception of odors and how the odors relate to social psychology and why I am so passionate about olfactory perception. Odors play really plenty of roles in our lives. They can influence our mood, our cognitive processes, and they also can affect our behavior. And the functions of the sense of smell can be grouped into three main categories. So these are functions related to ingestive behavior. So, for example, regulation of our appetite or a discrimination of edible products from non-edible products. They are also related to organism protection. That is, for example, they play alarm functions and enable us to detect different hazards and dangers. For example, humans are one of the most sensitive machines when it comes to detection of certain dangerous gases. Odors are also important in the context of social communication, so that's the most important part related to psychology. They affect human bonding, individual recognition. They can affect our mating processes, emotion recognition, and many other elements of our daily lives. Sorry, there's something wrong with the presentation. And as for the main issues which I'd like to talk about in my today's presentations, the first are odor sensitivity differences, the second are odor awareness differences, and the third are olfactory preferences across cultures. I have gathered the results of many of my previous studies, and I hope to present these in three main parts of this lecture. So as for the sensitivity differences, I will focus on the sources of differences and similarities in odor sensitivity. First of all, what is an odor sensitivity? I should probably clarify that because that's not a very intuitive issue for most social psychologists. What does it mean to be sensitive to odors? In the most basic understanding, a person sensitive to an odor is able to detect a certain concentration of this odor in his or her environment. And the level of the sensitivity, clarified in this way, is called a threshold of odor detection. So the threshold of your odor detection, Kasia, is the lowest possible concentration of an odor that you can detect in your environment. However, there are also other ways that can be used to assess odor sensitivity. For example, this can be discrimination of different odorants. And for example, many tests comprise the tasks where you are supposed to tell which two odors are the same and which one is different. And there are also tests that are focused on odor identification. So for example, you are asked to provide verbal labels to odors. And relatedly, there exist many different psychological tests that can be used to quantify these abilities. And the method that I mostly use are the sniffing sticks. And here you can see the sniffing sticks, the blue pens, the black pens, if you can see in the screen, are an odor identification test. And I use the sniffing sticks in the most studies that I will discuss during this lecture. First of all, one of the issues that you can find the most interesting is probably whether there exist any differences in olfactory abilities across different populations. So there were really, really few studies conducted in this regard. And actually, none of the studies that were conducted prior to our works were related to olfactory perception in non-industrialized populations. Based on the literature, it was very, very interesting to explore these groups because we were able to identify many, many sources of possible differences between cultures or between groups. And one of these were culture-related. So, for example, different importance attached to the sense of smell in certain groups, or education and wealth in certain societies. And the other group of factors that could possibly affect the olfactory perception and olfactory sensitivity are genetic differences between populations and evolution, because at some point in our development as a human species, the smell got less important than vision. However, there are still groups that use the sense of smell as a main source of information about, for example, food or dangers in their immediate environment. So we can assume that these modern evolutionary pressures make these groups particularly sensitive to odors. And also, as olfactory perception is more important in some societies, based on this training that they perform on a daily basis, they can get more sensitive to odors. First, I will focus on the nature part, which we analyzed in the two studies involving field research in some really nice and beautiful, but really remote location. The aim of these studies was to compare the thresholds of odor detection, and we assess the possible cultural and environmental factors that could have affected the sense of smell in different groups. We use the threshold test from the sniffing sticks test. And in study 1, we compared thresholds for the detection of Chimane of Bolivian Amazon and German people, while in study 2, we compared the sense of smell of the Chimane people, Polish people, and inhabitants of the Cook Islands. First, the Chimane. So the group that we worked with, and that was the group that actually inspired my research, because when we conducted field research over there with my husband, Piotr Sorokowski, we noticed that they are really, really, really sensitive to odors, and they seem to be guided by olfactory perception in many of their daily decisions. So this population seemed to be ideal for the study, but their olfactory perception in their daily lives was not the only aspect that made them a perfect group to conduct research with. So first of all, the Chimane are a very, very small isolated population that still lives in a traditional way. There is about 8,000 people in their population, and they live in approximately 120 villages located along the Maniqui River in Bolivia. They are hunting and foraging, and their subsistence centers on the river and all the products and agriculture that's related to river. So they still live and produce their food in a very traditional way. Basically, they are also pretty much isolated from modern cultural influences. For example, that was the way how we called the participants to join us in the village to perform the research. So no mobile connection. So there were also 3 potential issues that could have affected their performance in the smell test. So first of all, that was their traditional way of life, and also living in an unpolluted region of the Amazon. That's one of the locations that we worked with. And most adult Chimane are also illiterate, so we were also interested whether their performance in different olfactory tasks would differ depending on this lack of formal education. So as for the procedure, we had 150 Chimane participants, and we compared their olfactory performance to a group of 286 Germans from our previous study, and we used the sniffing sticks threshold test. When it comes to the results, they were actually, for me, of course, fascinating, because we noted that the Chimane participants exhibited a very, very, very good sense of smell on average. As you may see in this figure, there was a huge group of Chimane participants who scored very, very high in the olfactory test, because the numbers above 13 depict an extremely good sense of smell, while the numbers 15 to 16 indicate a level that's practically unattainable by modern European populations. So here you have the distribution of the results in the European group, so German participants. And as you can see, it differs quite dramatically from that of the Chimane, because we have most participants scoring in the middle section of the test, and that's the average performance of like a regular European group. But interestingly, we also noted that there is a group of Chimane participants, quite a high group, that scored quite low in the test. So basically, we can say that the median value for the Chimane was really, really high. So they had a very good sense of smell, and basically, on average, they scored quite better than the German population. So what does it mean in practice? In practice, it means that they detect a much lower concentration of an odor than a regular person that lives in Europe. It indicates that a 2- or 4-fold difference exists between their population and our populations in Europe. And males and females over there and here did not differ between each other. And why is it's so interesting that the Chimane had a different sense of smell? So, for example, based on these results, we can hypothesize that the natural environmental conditions can influence the sense of smell in such a way that it becomes a better trained sensory modality that enables us to guide our behaviors and different perceptions in a more structuralized and like a better way. So in simpler words, if you train your sense of smell, you become a really, really good smeller. It also means that there might be some environmental pressures that shape our sensory perception. We can generalize this finding into other sensory modalities. So we can, for example, hypothesize that if there is a group that focuses on visual perception, perhaps the visual perception thresholds or different abilities that relate to visual perception would become better. It is also important that we could analyze the effect of industrial pollution. It is maybe not that crucial from the point of view of psychology, but based on many studies in olfactory perception, it was hypothesized that the overall level of industrial pollution in our society influences our olfaction. However, it was very difficult to test it since everybody lives in a polluted environment. So non-industrialized societies allow us to perform these comparisons in like another different level. However, there was also an interesting group of the Chimane, whom I indicated to you in the previous figure, that scored much lower than German people. And we were really interested as to who these people were, and we conducted a follow-up study that involved these people, the Chimane people and another society. And we hypothesized that maybe that was a result of the lack of industrialization and lack of access to modern medicine that drove these low results. Because I don't know how familiar you are with studies on olfaction, but basically any olfactory problems that you can have, like infections or traumas or different diseases that affect your nervous system, can affect your olfaction permanently, or the changes that that you are going through can be just temporary. So it's possible that the level of infection that are uncured in this region was a determinant of very low performance of a certain group of these people. If you were interested in the full version of this paper, I invite you to the paper that we published based on the study. But I would like to show you now the results of our follow-up in the Cook Islands. The Cook Islanders were a group that we selected because they were also living in a very unpolluted region, and they were also using their sense of smell based on the regular basis. So probably the training related effects were also important in this group. So as for the ambient air pollution, as I mentioned, it is a very, very important factor that has detrimental effects on olfactory acuity. And for example, that was shown in a group that inhabited a region of Mexico City and a region that inhabited like the outskirts of Mexico City, with an obvious advantage of people living outside the big city. However, the previous research did not involve a comparison between very different regions and like populations that are not only distinct but geographically distinct and distant from each other. So olfactory studies, as I mentioned, involve often the environmental, genetic factors, and they also focus on culture. But here we wanted to assess the importance of air pollution and changes in lifestyle on olfactory abilities in modern human societies. So the choice of our population may seem a slightly complicated issue in this case. However, it was quite simple. We wanted to have three groups. One that would be industrialized, modern society that lives in a polluted region. Yes, so because we all live in a polluted region, but that would at the same time have access to all modern advantages of our civilization. So, for example, medicine. We also needed an indigenous society who would live in an unpolluted region, but at the same time would not have access to, for example, medical aid, and these would be the Chimane. And to analyze the influence of both the air pollution and the changes in lifestyle, we needed a third population. That would be a quite modern population. So a population that has access to medical doctors, to medication, and at the same time living in such a region where the industrial development is not that high. So the perfect group for this type of studies were the Cook Islanders. Pacific region is one of the least polluted places on Earth. It is also very beautiful, so I definitely recommend research there. And the Cook Islands are quite developed. They have a human development index similar to many European countries. But if you have a look at their settlements, they do not seem that industrialized. So we conducted our study in Palmerston and Aitutaki. These are two small islands in the Cook Island archipelago. As I mentioned, there is no industry and virtually no infrastructure. There are very few cars in Aitutaki and no cars in Palmerston. The picture that you see here is the main street in Palmerston. And Aitutaki is a small touristic island that has about 2,000 native inhabitants, and it's 250 kilometers north from the main island of Rarotonga. And Palmerston is a super tiny island that has about 60 inhabitants. And it is about 500 kilometers northwest of Rarotonga. You can only get there by a private boat, actually. There are cargo boats that travel there once in 6 months, or if the weather is bad, once a year. But it's possible to charter a boat and get over there if you're really determined to perform your research. So basically that's how we got there. We chartered a boat and we were so lucky to be there for a few weeks and to work with these people. Our participants were 25 people from Palmerston, so that may seem little, but that was like the majority of the adult population in Palmerston. We also had 36 people from Aitutaki, and we compared their scores with 168 people sample from Poland. and the Chimane Amerindians, whom I mentioned before. Our procedure again involved the snipping sticks threshold subtest, and the most important part and the most interesting part are results. So in the Cook Islands, sorry, but the graph is reversed as compared to what you saw in the previous part of the presentation. So the best scores are still the 15, 16, and 13, 14, but they are on the left-hand side. So as you see, the Cook Islanders performed fantastically in the test. Polish people were really similar to the German sample, whom I have shown in the previous part of the lecture, and the performance in the Amazon, as seen in the previous graph, differed dramatically from both of our other samples. So we had a significant effect of the study site, wherein people from the Cook Islands, so the developed but unpolluted region, had significantly lower thresholds of odor detection, so they performed better in the smell test than the industrialized Europeans, who live in a very, maybe not very, but a relatively polluted region, and the Chimane people. And the olfactory acuity scores of the Europeans were actually significantly lower than the scores of the two remaining groups. So that suggests that the industrial pollution and all the effects of our daily exposure to pollutants is really quite bad and detrimental for our olfaction. So basically, it seems that we are doomed because the most important source of differences among the study population was the influence of environmental factors on the sense of smell of our participants. And we may only suggest that there are some factors that influence the olfaction, negatively influence the olfaction in groups that are non-industrialized. And for example, in the Chimane, it could be the cooking practices that involve a lot of fires, because they cook on an open fire and they consume a lot of local alcohol, and they have no access to medical services. As for the high proportion of non-industrialized Chimane who performed really well in the threshold task, we could also assume that in addition to the environmental factors that made their olfaction not ruined, as in our case, there are also some additional training influences. So, for example, we can suggest that there are many other groups whom we can study to determine whether there are some mechanisms or other factors that shape our olfactory sensitivity and account for the differences between the groups. If you're interested in the results of this paper and you would like to read the paper, it was published in Science of the Total Environment. So this was basically the part of my research that was dedicated to odor sensitivity differences. So the differences in the level of odor that you can detect. Kasia and others, and you are all able to smell in your environment. However, there are also other aspects of olfactory perception that are perhaps not that well quantified with the use of psychophysical tests, but they're also very important when it comes to odor perception. And these are, for example, odor awareness. And this is odor awareness. Odor awareness is like a perceived odor importance and the significance that we attach to odors in our daily lives or in our regular social interactions. And if you focus for a second on this olfactory awareness of yours, you can also assume that there were many individual and cultural level factors that have shaped it and that have influenced it over the course of your lives. So the next part, the second part of my lecture is focused on odor awareness. And I'd like to show you a result, the result of our work, my work and my collaborators' work on olfactory awareness. So first, let me explain what odor awareness is. So it reflects the extent to which people are affected by odors in their everyday life, and they're like a metacognition of olfactory sensations. And there are a few scales that focus on this concept. For example, Ilona Croy's scale and Monique Smith's works. And you may note that in such scales, much attention is paid to social odors. So a fact that, like, an issue that could be of interest to you as a psychologist. For example, a respondent is asked, do you notice the smell of other people's breath? Or do you notice the odor of your colleague if he or she changed her perfume? An odor-oriented person pays much attention to odors in everyday life, and is likely, for example, to feel positive or negative emotions as a result of exposure to certain odors. And as odors play an important role in attachment and romantic relationships, it is also likely that people with high odor awareness are prone to noting this olfactory environment in their relationship, and they are likely to be impacted by social odors in their lives. For example, higher olfactory awareness might intensify the emotions that you feel as a result of exposure to your partner's odor. And from the cross-cultural perspective, there are certain factors that could influence the culture levels, responsiveness to social odors. The factors that may differ between cultures that were indicated by very early classical research are there's different attitudes to personal odors. So, for example, in a different cross-cultural work, Mexicans described their social odors as more important than the Koreans, Czechs, and Germans. And they recalled, for example, more odors pertaining to social category than members of other cultures. When it comes to the emergence of such cultural differences in olfactory perception, they seem to appear pretty early in our development. For example, Saxton and colleagues found that Namibian children reported higher social odor awareness than Czech children, while Fedenzi and collaborators observed that Finnish children tended to report more attention paid to odors than French children. But nevertheless, to date, only a few cross-cultural studies showed that there are differences between cultures when it comes to olfactory awareness, and they usually covered very, very low number of countries, and it was difficult to explain the sources of these cross-cultural differences based on the previous works. So our aim was to explore social odor awareness, because I was mostly interested in social odors, in relation to a number of potential factors that could have influenced the cultural level and individual level of this social odor awareness. So existing literature enabled us to identify certain individual and cultural factors that seem to be related to attitudes towards social and personal odors. And these were, for example, gender and age, material situation and education, and interpersonal distance preferences when in the group of individual level factors, whereas in the country level factors, we selected population density, temperature, and human development index as factors that could have possibly affected the social odor awareness. When it comes to the cultural level factors, the variables that we selected were actually related to exposure to social odors. So yeah, we assume that these factors could have enhanced the social density, social connectedness, and at the same time influence the level of social odors that we experience in our daily contact. So population density, for example, when you think about population density, living in populous sites may enhance the exposure to other people. So at the same time, it can also enhance the exposure to their odors through more frequent social contexts. And temperature can be related to preferred social proximity and indirectly influence the proximity in a variety of social contexts. But temperature is also a physiologically important variable that affects the production of odors, of body odors, and that also affects the intensity of these odors. As for the socioeconomic status, so the level of wealth in the certain culture, we also assume that this could be related to personal hygiene and access to, for example, cosmetics and other elements that enable us to control our social odors on a daily basis. When we think about the group of individual level factors that we selected, gender. Women value odors more than men. Basically, that's a rule. Women pay more attention to odors, and that was observed both in the mating context, but also outside the mating context. Odor awareness is also linked to a number of female stereotype activities in childhood and adulthood, so probably that's like a vicious cycle. Yes, we are taught to pay attention to odors, and then we actually do pay attention to odors more. Odor awareness may be also correlated with olfactory abilities, and studies consistently show that our olfaction deteriorates with age, a sad fact. As for education and material situation, again, these may relate to the previously mentioned care for personal hygiene and access to the cosmetics that enable to control it. And education also potentially alters olfactory perception because it has an indirect connection with olfactory acuity as measured by the olfactory tests. As for the interpersonal distance preferences, similar to the mechanism related to the cultural level factors, it may affect our olfactory awareness through exposure. If you prefer a very low social distance to strangers, let's take strangers, then you are exposed to stranger body odor really frequently. Yes, when we have people who prefer very low distances, they are often exposed to odors of other people. So this social odor awareness may be enhanced through this mutual influence. So the study sample in this particular project were over 10,000 participants inhabiting 52 study sites, and our participants were aged between 17 and 88 years. And it's crucial to note here that in most study locations, the populations that we had comprised not only students, but also the community sample. So all local collaborators were instructed to recruit as diverse study samples as possible. That was very important from the point of view of social odor awareness measurement, because students, but you know that they are very often a very uniform group that shares similar passions or similar cultural exposure. So we were really determined to gather a diverse cross-cultural sample. And our cross-cultural sample, our cross-cultural examination involved researching quite a high number of regions. I will give you a second to quickly scan this list, perhaps. But what I feel particularly proud about is that we had study sites representing Asia, Africa, Europe, and Americas. So we did quite well when it comes to the distribution all over the globe. As for the methods, we selected questions on social odor perception from Monique-Smith scale. And these were, do you pay attention to the perfume, the aftershave, or deodorant other people use? How important is it to you that your partner has a pleasant smell? Do you notice the smell of people's breath or sweat? Or when someone has an unpleasant body odor, does that make you find him or her unattractive? and you are in a public space, sitting close to someone who has an unpleasant smell. Do you look for another seat if possible? Try to address these questions yourselves. It is quite obvious, of course, for people who conduct psychological studies, what are the answers of people who are aware to odors, but you can try to be sincere with yourselves and try to assess your social odors, social odor awareness in a quite objective way. Our analysis comprised multi-level regression models, so the hierarchically linear models, and in the first part of the analysis, we had a baseline, like an APT model, to estimate the variability of the sense of smell or the olfactory awareness in the social context across countries that we included. In the second step, we assessed the individual level variables and their influence on our outcomes. And in the third step, we included the country level predictors. So, following all these steps enable us to compare the three models and to show which of them is the best and best explains the variability in our data. So I don't know how expert you are in statistics, but if some of you are not, please don't get scared. By this table, actually, it's pretty straightforward. What we see here in the bottom, the place where a circle now appeared, is that the model properties differed, and we have the properties of the three models indicated here below. And depending on the predictors we included in the analysis, we have like a different level of different proportion of results explained by different factors. So here you have a model that is like a baseline, an empty model. It's now circled with a gray circle. There you have a summary of the individual, of a model including individual level factors, and you can see that the value here decreased, indicating a better model fit, and including the cultural level factors did not increase the predictive value of the model. So overall, the comparison of this model, of these models, showed that individual characteristics were kind of super strongly related to our outcomes, whereas inclusion of the cultural level predictors changed very little. So the reported odor awareness in different social contexts seemed to depend quite a lot on the individual level factors that we included, so the gender, age, and education. But the inclusion of other cultural level factors was not that important. So, summing up the findings of this research, our participants generally differed in terms of odor awareness. And although there was some cross-cultural variance in social odor awareness, the main differentiating role was played by individual level factors. The country level factors were not that super crucial. And these results confirm that individual differences play an important role in social odor awareness. So in all aspects of odor awareness that are related to non-verbal communication, non-verbal olfactory communication between humans. So this suggests that people living in different cultures and different climate conditions may still share similar patterns of odor awareness in social contexts, if only they share other individual level characteristics. Findings on individual level factors affecting social odor awareness are consistent with previously reported age and gender-related differences in odor perception. So women consider olfactory perception more important than men. In the self-report questionnaires related both to sexual and non-sexual contexts. And also, I may note here that collaborators show that female respondents judge the sense of smell as more important than the male participants they had in Germany. And also in other previous works, you and collaborators showed that in 4 countries that they included in their study, women also indicated a higher interest in the sense of smell than men. So what is new in our study is that we extend these findings to a larger number of cultures, showing that it's quite a uniform finding. Basically, women all over the world pay more attention to odors in social context than men. When it comes to the aging effect, it was also important that we noted that people, basically, the older they got, the less odor aware they are. And it should be noted here that our study focused on gender, not on gender odor awareness, but on the social odor awareness. So all the aspects of odor perception that are important in the social context, but not odor perception in general. So there was, of course, we can suggest based on these findings that people pay attention to odors, less attention to odors when they get older in general. But what we tested here were basically social factors. And it can be assumed that people get less aware of the odors since their sensitivity decreases with age. As for the age differences, we explored the issue of individual level differences in age in odor sensitivity in a sample of over 1,000 people, 1,400 people who undertook an odor identification test. And we have indeed found that odor identification scores of the youngest and oldest participants were much lower than those of the people in the middle of the scale. So as you can see in this figure, this was especially notable for participants aged above 70 and participants aged below 10 years. So numerous papers explain this deterioration of the sense of smell in old people. Lower olfactory abilities might be a result of the deteriorating cells in their noses, also the neurodegenerative processes, and also overall the cumulative damage to an organism. And as for children, it seems rather unlikely that their lower performance in this study on odor sensitivity relates to diseases or disorders that are common in older age. However, it needs to be remembered that this particular study involved an odor identification test, and verbal abilities of children are basically a bit lower. And further, the olfactory performance in odor identification tests relates also to prior exposure to certain odors. So children could perform worse not because their olfaction is so bad, but because they are just non-familiar with the odors. If you are interested in the issue of sex differences in olfactory perception and olfactory awareness, you may be also interested in the meta-analysis that we conducted as a kind of response to a long-lasting debate in the scientific literature on olfactory perception and sex differences. And summing up the results of the findings of this meta-analysis, basically women were a tiny bit better than men, but yeah, let me tell you a bit more about these works. So our analysis included results of hundreds of studies that used the sniffing-sticks test, and we had the olfactory threshold test, we had the discrimination test, and we had identification test. So 3 different subgroups of olfactory performance. There is also another very popular olfactory test that was used in a number of studies, and that's the University of Pennsylvania smell identification test. And summing up the results of all these comparisons was that the effect sizes that show the advantage of women were really, really weak. They range between 0.8 and 0.30. And there are many possible factors that could have affected the outcomes of the studies that we included in our meta-analysis. And although basically our findings confirm the common knowledge about the better olfactory perception in women, I wouldn't say that this debate is solved, because the effect sizes and like the distribution of the results clearly indicates that the effects are very small. And so are women better in terms, like, are women objectively better in terms of olfaction? Rather not. But going back to the olfactory awareness differences that I showed before, they are much more focused on odors. And there are several interesting future directions that can be inspired by the combination of all these studies that I have shown you. So, for example, the similar pattern of results across the study sites that we included opens questions on biological determinants of olfactory awareness that drive the individual level differences in social odor awareness. And for example, it's also interesting to explore the preference for these social odors, because these can be genetically determined. So possibly the subjective importance of these odors can also be related to some innate genetic factors. This has not been tested so far, and it's, for me at least, very, very interesting. We should also note that the 30% of variability in our results was pertained to the cultural level factors. So the national wealth and temperature and population density that we included in our results did not fully account for the diversity in that we observed between the cultures. So it's possible that there are other cultural level factors that could be further explored and that could drive the differences in odor awareness in our different cultures. So the full version of this paper is available here in Chemical Senses, and I absolutely invite you to read the paper. Let me take a bit of water. Sorry. So that was the part of my lecture that was dedicated to olfactory awareness. I hope you are now more olfactory aware yourselves, and you could say a bit more about your preferences to odors in social context. But there are not only social odors in our environments. We also have plenty of other odors that surround us. And the third part of my lecture relates to olfactory preferences. The idea that I tested in my study was that preferences across cultures vary not only in the social context, but they should also vary in other subgroups of odor stimuli. And I first explored the olfactory preferences in children. As Kasia mentioned in the beginning of this lecture, I am now very much interested in olfactory determinants of food neophobia. So I was also interested in basically olfactory preferences of children, because one of the most important aspects that drives our behavioral responses to odors is the perceived pleasantness of these odors. So the question that I asked myself was that whether people do agree or disagree in odor assessments. And one of the most important things that drives the olfactory pleasantness seemed to be the odorant structure. And many researchers argue that actually everybody all over the world should basically agree on which odor is pleasant and which odor is unpleasant, because that just lies in the chemical structure of an odor. However, there is also another aspect of olfactory perception and odor pleasantness perception, and that's familiarity. So if you know the odor, you typically like it more it's a common rule that's observed in many psychological studies related not only to olfactory perception, but to other types of perception. And the second group of researchers that ferociously argues with the first group of researchers says that our culture is a crucial determinant of our odor preferences because it drives the exposure to different smells. So we decided to tackle this question, or rather have our response in this debate as well by conducting 2 studies that would include children. So a group that's a bit less influenced by culture than adult people. And our first study involved a group of children from 18 countries. And the study has not been published so far, but in short, the results indicate that hedonic perception of odors across all these groups can be explained. It can really be explained by culture because the children whom we had in our study showed a bit similar olfactory preferences. They were rather consistent. However, we also found this significant effect of odor identification performance. So basically, we cannot say a yes or a no in this debate related to the nature or nurture part of odor preferences, because if children performed better in an odor identification task, this means that they knew their odors better. So this odor familiarity has also affected their hedonic perception. So we had 511 people aged from 5 to 8 years, and they completed the USNIP test. And as I mentioned before, the participants were evenly distributed across 18 countries. And they rated, in addition to identifying each odor, they also rated the odor pleasantness. Each sample that they smell was not only identified, but also assessed in the case of the pleasantness. So as I mentioned before, it is difficult to say whether children are actually whether these results in children are a voice in favor of olfactory preferences diversity, or whether it actually confirms that the odor preferences are uniform. We conducted also another study that involved the traditional population of Hadza, and that involved Chumane people and a group of Papuan people. They rated the pleasantness of all these odors that you can find on the screen. They were mostly derived from the sniffing sticks task. And the pleasantness of the odors that they rated was compared to the pleasantness that we found in the Polish population. So what I'm showing you here are quite preliminary results, so I did not really analyze them in a beautiful way, so excuse the table. But differences between Poland and non-industrialized populations were mostly meaning that people in Poland like the odors more than people in non-industrialized population, and that was mostly observed for banana and peach and onion and cinnamon and coffee and leather. And there were also some odors where we found slight differences between populations, and these were mostly butanol and butter and strawberry. So this study in adults, again, gave us no clear answer when it comes to the effect of a culture on olfactory preferences, because although we did observe a significant effect of a culture for the comparison of non-industrialized groups with an industrialized population, we also observe some striking similarities. These were especially notable for unpleasant odors. So this may open a new question related to innate aversions to certain odors, and perhaps suggest that the universality in odor preferences that was suggested by this super large group of researchers pertains mostly to odors that are unpleasant, and these odors are unpleasant because they are somehow biologically meaningful across populations. So it's possible that there are some innate aversions that we share regardless of the culture. Summarizing this smaller part of my studies related to olfactory preferences, I may say that the question of olfactory preferences is really the most difficult so far in the smell perception studies that I have conducted, but I would be very happy to hear your comments on that. And basically, when it comes to my whole lecture, I would like to show you a few of the take-home messages, and these are that there are many aspects of our olfactory perception that are affected by both biological and cultural mechanisms, but among the key dimensions of olfactory perception, the smell abilities are influenced by the smell sensitivity seems to be influenced by environment and evolutionary pressures, so more on the biological side, whereas the identification relates mostly to culture and experience and our verbal abilities. Odor awareness is mostly related to our individual differences, so who we are and on the individual level is more important than where we live or what our culture is. As for the innate preferences, innate aversions that I showed in the pleasantness studies that we conducted in the olfactory area, I would be very happy to explore the issue of innate aversions in my further work, but it seems that there is some truth over there. And as I said before, I'd be happy to hear your comments, especially with regard to this part. So I hope I was able to guide you a bit through this olfactory world. It is not an obvious sensory modality in psychological research, so I hope that I might have stimulated some of the brain regions that you have not used so far and maybe opened some new research ideas. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Agnieszka. Thank you. Thank you very much.